Puddle Lane, Peter Puffle's mouse. Peter Puffle's mouse. It was a very fine day. The sun was shining down on Puddle Lane, and Davy and Sarah went out to play. They were just going into the garden at the end of the lane when they saw Peter Puffle. "Sarah, Davy, wait for me," shouted Peter Puffle. Davy and Sarah were going into the garden. They saw Peter Puffle. Peter was carrying a little cage with a white mouse in it. "Just look at her," cried Peter, holding up the cage. "Isn't she a beauty?" "Don't make such a noise," said Sarah. "You'll frighten her." "Where did you get her?" asked Davy. "Uncle Percy gave her to me," said Peter Puffle. Peter Puffle had a little white mouse. They went into the garden. "I'm going to get some dry grass for my mouse," said Peter. "Then she can make a nest." "We've got some nuts for the wood mice who live in the hollow tree," said Davy. "Come and see them." "They won't be as good as my mouse," said Peter Puffle. "She's the best mouse in Candletown." They all went into the garden to get some grass for the mouse. As they went towards the hollow tree, they saw Mr. Gotobed. Mr. Gotobed was sitting on the grass, propped up against a stone bench. He was fast asleep. "What's he sleeping there for?" asked Peter. "He's always sleeping," said Sarah. They saw Mr. Gotobed. "Mr. Gotobed is always sleeping," said Sarah. They came to the hollow tree. "This is where the wood mice live," said Sarah. "Have you got the nuts, Davy?" Davy dropped a nut into the hollow tree. "I can't see any mice," said Peter. "Shh," said Sarah. "You'll frighten them." The wood mice lived in a hollow tree. Davy dropped a nut into the tree. A wood mice came out of a hole and began to eat the nut. "Look," cried Peter, "there's one." The wood mice picked up the nut and ran back down the hole. "You frightened them away," said Sarah. "You have to be quiet if you want to see wood mice." "I'd rather have my mouse," said Peter. "She doesn't run away." "She would if she could," said Sarah. "No, she wouldn't," said Peter. "Let's get the dry grass for her," said Davy. A wood mouse came out and ate the nut. "Look," cried Peter Puffle. The mouse ran away. There was some dry grass by the hollow tree. Some of it was very long. Davy and Peter picked some handfuls of dry grass. As they went back towards the gates, they passed Mr. Gotobed. Mr. Gotobed was still fast asleep. He was snoring gently. Peter put down the grass and the cage with the mouse inside it. "Watch me," he said. Mr. Gotobed was fast asleep. He took a piece of long grass. He tiptoed over to Mr. Gotobed and began to tickle Mr. Gotobed's nose with the end of the grass. Mr. Gotobed's nose twitched. Mr. Gotobed brushed his hand across his face, but he didn't open his eyes. Peter Puffle tickled Mr. Gotobed's nose. Mr. Gotobed didn't wake up. Peter tickled Mr. Gotobed's nose again. Mr. Gotobed shook his head, but he didn't wake up. Peter went on tickling. Mr. Gotobed gave a great sneeze. Achoo! He opened his eyes and sat up. Peter hid the grass behind his back. Peter Puffle tickled Mr. Gotobed's nose. Mr. Gotobed woke up. "Hello, Peter," said Mr. Gotobed. "Are you playing in the garden? There are a lot of flies in here today. One of them keeps landing on my nose." Mr. Gotobed was just settling down to go to sleep again when Sarah called out, "Peter, where's your mouse? She's not in the cage." Mr. Gotobed went back to sleep. Sarah cried, "Look!" Peter ran over to the cage. The cage was empty. The door was open and the mouse had gone. "You let it out," cried Peter. Of course I didn't, said Sarah. You must have knocked the catch off the door when you put the cage down. Peter began to cry. I've got to find her, he said. We'll help you, said Davy. She can't have gone far. But you have to keep quiet, Peter, or you'll frighten her, said Sarah. The door of the cage was open. The little mouse had gone. They began to look for the mouse. What's that? Whispered Davy. Look over there in the grass. They crept over to look, but it wasn't the mouse. It was a frog. Where's it going? Whispered Davy. There's a lake on the other side of the house, whispered Sarah. Perhaps it's going there. I've got to find my mouse, said Peter tearfully. They looked for the mouse. They saw a frog, but they didn't see the mouse. Let's look along the wall, said Sarah. There are some holes there. Perhaps she's gone into one. There were some snails on the wall, but there was no sign of the mouse. They looked for the mouse. They saw the snails, but they didn't see the mouse. She's not here, said Peter, and I've got to find her. She must be somewhere. Perhaps she's with the wood mice, said Davy. I expect she was lonely all on her own. They were just going back to the hollow tree when Sarah whispered, Look. They were going back to the hollow tree when Sarah said, Look. Mr. Gotobed was still sitting propped up against the bench fast asleep. His hat was tilted over his eyes, and Peter's mouse was sitting on top of his hat. The mouse was sitting on Mr. Gotobed's hat. Peter was going to run forward, but Sarah caught his arm. Shh, she said. Don't frighten her. Let Davy do it. He's good with mice. Let Davy get the mouse, said Sarah. Davy tiptoed over to Mr. Gotobed. He held out his hand. A nut was lying on his fingers. The little mouse saw the nut. Davy put his hand very close to the hat, and the little mouse climbed onto his hand to eat the nut. The little mouse saw the nut. She began to eat it. Davy gently carried the mouse back to Peter. Here you are, Peter, he said. Let's put it back in the cage, said Peter. It's a very small cage, said Sarah. Uncle Percy's getting me a bigger one, said Peter. Davy took the mouse back to Peter Puffle. They had just put the little mouse back in the cage when Mr. Puffle came into the garden. Hello, Sarah, Davy, said Mr. Puffle. Have you got that dry grass, Peter? I've got lots of it, said Peter. Good, said Mr. Puffle. I've got a much bigger cage for your mouse, and I've got another mouse to be with her so that she won't be lonely. Bring the mouse along and we'll put her in a new home. Mr. Puffle came into the garden. So Sarah, Davy, Peter, and the mouse all went back into Puddle Lane to put Peter's mouse in her new home. They all went back to Puddle Lane with the little white mouse.